Okay, I can turn it. Hi. Oh, you're muted. Hold on, let me unmute you. Okay.
You got me?
Now we gotcha.
Fantastic.
And we got Gus, and we got Bill, and we got Dad. And we
Right. The whole crew.
This is good.
Where are the Weedhams today?
There we go. There we go.
Are they in Africa? Yeah.
We got Cheryl.
Wow.
Right. We got, all right. Well, cheers, everybody. Welcome to Happy Hour.
Yeah, yeah.
Cheers. Awesome.
Cindy, did you make the thing? Oh, wait. Hold on. You're muted. Cindy, did you make the thing?
No, it got a late start. I just browned the pine nuts, and now I'm gonna do the shallots.
Okay.
So
It'll be late.
you'll be the test
Okay.
kitchen.
Yeah.
I'm
You can
excited.
let us know later what you think.
Introduce
That's okay.
people.
Okay. Okay, you turn it down. Go ahead. You can turn it down.
All right. So we should introduce Ron. Ron, wave.
Oh, here we go. I'm back.
Okay. He's going to be our guest speaker today. So my guess is, here we go. We got a few more people logging in. So does everybody, first question, what vintages of Côte does everybody have? Are we all drinking Côte?
No.
No.
Uh-oh.
Oh, Harv's in California. You just zipped right down there, didn't you?
Bill, you've got the 12, I think. All right.
Yes, I'm in California.
It's summertime there.
So, Michael, where are you today?
Oh, he's got the 12.
Where's Weedham?
Mike, what's your background today? Here, you have to unmute yourself to. Where are you?
There it is. It's Belair Graf Winery in South Africa.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a destination winery. You'll have to go there when you decide to expand your.
Expand my horizons.
Yes.
Someday I'll get out of
Into
Sunnyside.
winery.
I'm hoping.
You know,
Hoping.
Yeah, it's a beautiful winery. But
Well, I'm glad I'm not in South Africa right now because they can't sell wine. They could bring in the rest of their harvest, but they can't export. They can't sell it at all. 2015, Micah, you're drinking a baby. Did you decant it?
No?
We'll give it a good swirl.
Yeah, give some air.
So, South Africa is one of the few major wine regions in the world that I have not been to, and every time I see pictures from there, I want to get on a plane and just go.
Oh, it's a beautiful area. But that was, we went to 4 wineries, and that was the best of the 4 we saw as far as wines and things like that. But it's a destination winery, and it's got the whole massages and place to stay and the whole 9 yards. It's really well done.
We did do that.
We just have the kitchen.
Well, I know, but when you decide to expand and get the destination north started, you'll visit there.
See, this is why we keep Dad muted, just for fun, because otherwise, I'm going to mute you too, Mike. You're done. We don't need more work. So, speaking of our test kitchen, Mama, would you like to talk about what you came up with today? This is her
This is the
second iteration of the
Shallot Tarte Tatin. And I don't know how many of you tried it, but it's surprisingly easy. It looks a little fancier than it is to make. But
oh, it's super fancy.
But I think,
Fancy.
yeah, it's pretty fancy. It's kind of like a destination winery.
Easy. In what world are you in, Kathy? I'm still slaving over the stove here.
Is that Paul? Where's
Yeah, it's Paul.
Paul,
I'll
where's your
be on
picture?
Zoom when I can get this thing in the oven.
Okay, all right. Well, it's pretty simple.
This is real happy hour. So many people do tasting, wine tastings, and they say they're boring and they're not interactive. And this way, we all get to do real happy hour. We get to eat together. We get to cook together. Apparently,
We can travel together all over the
we're all going to
world,
South Africa.
or California. I mean, everyone wants to be there.
Hey,
So,
Karen,
anyways, I was
about-
thinking that that balsamic reduction with the mushrooms, that earthiness, and that little bit of sweetness would go really well with this wine. So I hope it does.
I think so. I concur. Micah, you want me to unmute? You got it?
It's precious.
Yeah, so when you asked if I decanted it, the reason I said no is because we realized we're white trash and we don't have a decanter. We only have an aerator, so we'll have to put that on our list.
All right, now we know what you need for Christmas. Because you can, so even the older coats, but if you're gonna drink age-worthy wines, like it's the difference between Train Station and the Côte Bonneville is Train Station, we make it to drink young, we make it so that you can just open that screw cap and put it in the glass and don't worry about it. It's guilt-free. As soon as it comes off the line, it can go into your mouth, totally cool. Coat, on the other hand, you're gonna drink it from 15. It would be nice. You put it in a pitcher.
Yeah, you can put it in a pitcher and then pour it back in the bottle. That's fine. Just get some air to it.
But get some air to it because Mom had like an 06?
No.
Wait, if I put it in the pitcher, does that mean I have to drink the whole bottle tonight?
We put a lot of thought and preparation into this. We start
Red
early.
wine, so it's all on me.
A couple weeks ago, Mom had it days ago. I don't remember. Time's fluid right now, right? Mom called me the next day. She's like, or she sent me a text or called or something, and she's like, "Yeah, after I don't know, God, that's too many fingers for the
4?
screen." Hold
It
on.
was an 8.
Okay, use your words, Dad. You're unmuted.
It was an 8, and it took it over 4 hours to open up.
I had a 3 too. That was pretty good. But yeah, it did take a long time. So when they open up, they're just even better. But whoops, sometimes. So a little bigger.
We're starting well.
You
So
make
Ron,
it
I'm glad
last.
we're gonna let you talk for most of this because apparently we're like 2 sips in and we're cut off already.
Hey, it is happy hour. I mean, it should be, true to the spirit.
Yeah, apparently.
Tony,
So-
what are you drinking?
Which one am I drinking?
Tony.
No, Tony. Tony's up in Canada, so he doesn't always have the same
Oh.
wines.
I have the, where am I here? Hold on.
You're good. And you're unmuted. We can hear you.
Okay. No, I shrunk, my screen shrunk. I actually have the estate bottled coat, and what year is it? 03.
Oh, that's okay.
Nice.
There you go. I had one of those the other night. Takes it a while to open up.
Wow.
I was trying to say that, and then they told me it was an 8. We had that too. We do a lot of research for this.
Yeah. Mom's been working hard. Working hard lately.
Yeah. Oh, look, Adrish is on.
Yeah, but we don't have any. We need Adrish to get his video and his background because he's always somewhere at Côte Bonneville. So
Where in the world is Adrish tonight?
Mm.
That's his cool guy pose.
Huh?
That's his cool guy pose.
Yeah.
He's his cool guy pose.
Yeah.
I actually took that picture. I made him pose like that. That smirk on his face is him laughing at me. So, and since he's not talking, that means I can say goofy things about him all day long. So, okay, so Mom's been working hard tasting wine. You all feel really bad for her, I'm sure. And Dad has been working hard in the vineyard. So I have some pictures of what's going on in the vineyard. You have to give me 1 sec, Dad. You ready? Talk about the vineyard? Okay,
Am I unmuted?
you are. You're good to go.
Oh. Okay, so we have some pictures that we took this morning.
Where do you want to start?
We're going to start. Well, the number one thing is that 4 weeks ago, we were at Bud's Swell. And so we've done these photographs every week sequentially of the same Syrah portion of the vine and the same Cabernet Sauvignon portion of the vine, and the progression that has occurred in the 4 weeks from bud swell to bud break to shoot. Okay, so there's bud break.
Yep, that's 4 weeks ago. I don't have all of them in sequence.
Yeah, that's 415. So that's okay. And then that's the Syrah. So you want to pop the Syrah vine up from today?
Yes. That's the Syrah vine this morning.
So this is a Syrah vine this morning, 4 weeks later, and it's congested. There's a whole lot going on. There's a lot of vigor. And so we shoot thinned this section of the vine so you could see what the ladies are beginning to do with the entire vineyard this week. And so the next picture shows how much was taken off. And so we look for shoots that have clusters on them, and we look for shoots that are regeneration shoots. And so down at the very base on the cordon, you'll see a shoot that is coming in, and that's going to be a regeneration shoot. The tall one has got fruit on it, and each of the others in that section have clusters on the shoots. And we stripped away the ones that were too congested, that were malpositioned, or that didn't have fruit on them and not regeneration shoots. So then the next pair of pictures was from Cabernet Sauvignon this morning. Syrah charges out ahead of everything else. And so weeks ago, this was just in bud swell. It came on later than the Syrah. But you can see it's raring to go right now. And so we shoot thin that one. You can see the clusters developing on those shoots very readily here. And so that's what's going to be your grape berries. And then the next picture will show how that was thinned. So there's a whole lot less going on. We want room for the sunlight to get to the leaves, sunlight to get to the clusters. We don't want an excessive number of clusters. We want to protect the regeneration shoots. And so those goals are met with both of these different varietals that you're seeing from this morning. So that's the update from the vineyard.
All right.
Very nice.
And we'll do one more vineyard shot as a reminder of where, because all of these wines are so site specific, and the carriage house, which we had, I forget how many weeks ago, was from down here in this lower planting down at the bottom. And that has a completely different soil type to up here on the hillside. So the coat is the blend. It's about 60% Cab, 40% Merlot.
Other way around. Oh, that's right. Okay.
This is going to be happy hour. Woo! She's cut off. So this block up here is where the Cab comes from. And then you get a little lower down here where it's not so steep. It's a little more gentle slope, and that's where the Merlot is. And that's the basis of this wine. So very site specific. And I was thinking with the geology being so different between these two blocks that it might be kind of fun one of these days to have a geologist come in and do a better explanation of the geology than I would do of all of Eastern Washington and our site specifically. So
Well, it pulls out of the oven and in the vineyard.
there we go. And Adrisha's too. They're actually in the same spot in the vineyard, conveniently enough. So what do you guys like that idea? Do you think geology would be interesting?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, Ron, what are you drinking? What kind of beer?
This is a blood orange IPA from 21st Amendment.
Oh,
Yes. Not bitter, not high in alcohol. It's more like a session.
all right. You'll have to come back for the Riesling one because it's our sessionable wine.
Exactly. So my apologies in advance. My internet seems to be a little bit dodgy right now, so I cut in and out, but hopefully we'll make it through.
We'll make it through. So one last thing before we get into barrels, since Adrish and Paul are both in the vineyard, don't forget to register for the virtual vineyard tours. If you haven't already, tomorrow we're at 5:30, we're doing DeBrule Vineyard, and we will be looking, we're gonna kind of do what I just did with the variation in the different blocks, and then looking at how that contrasts with Red Willow and Quintessence over on Red Mountain. So it'll be kind of fun to see how much nuance and variability there is around the valley. And onto that, then once we grow all these beautiful grapes and we harvest all these beautiful grapes, then we put them into barrels to make beautiful wines. And since you guys had so much fun with barrels last week, we are back to barrels again. And Ron's barrels go into Cote and Carriage House go into those barrels, whereas all the Chardonnay goes into the boot barrels, which Manny was representing last week. So take it away, Ron.
Okay, so I'll give you just a quick overview. I've been in the cooperage business now for about 20 years. Prior to that, I worked some vintages in Mendocino County, in the Santa Cruz Mountains at David Bruce Winery, focusing on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and also at Dr. Fogarty's vineyard in Woodside, California, which was Chardonnay and Pinot Noir as well. And that was in, I believe, 2001. And I've been pretty much in the cooperage industry since. So what we'll do is give you sort of a kind of an overview of where we source the French oak, how we source it, and a little bit of the reasons behind it. So I'll go ahead and share a screen here. Can everybody see this okay?
Mhm.
Okay, so let's start here. So we'll just, I already prefaced some of this. The bulk of the barrels used in the wine industry for fine wine are from these regions, but France, Hungary, and of course, American oak throughout the States. In France and Hungary, we're basically using the same species of wood, Quercus sessile, pedunculate, robur, and they're very similar, and maybe structurally there's some subtle differences, but this is primarily where all of the coopers in the industry are sourcing wood. And this is just sort of a small illustration of where we are buying the logs from the Department of Forestry in France. As far north as the Vosges and as far south as Limousin, and where some of the more popular barrels seem to be, or regions, is Nevers, Tronchet, and Allier. And that's where you'll see most of the wood coming from for fine wine barrels. So unlike the barrels or the logs that we buy in the United States, all of the wood that we buy in France is dictated by the government. So this is a huge source of GDP for them. And a lot of folks don't realize that we compete against other industries for this premium oak, one of which is the parquet flooring manufacturing facilities in China. So they will typically bid pretty high for these lots of wood. So during the bidding process, it's all done at a silent auction, and it's controlled by the government. And if we submit bids and we begin to lose them, we obviously know that we're not bidding high enough. And the government is smart enough to put the premium lots at the very end, so they know that they're going to be at the higher price points, which is typically some of the wood that we are buying for oak barrels. Now, everybody that's been in a winery has probably seen a forest name stamped on a barrel head. Tronchet is very popular. Sometimes you'll see COF for Center of France. And this was sort of the old world no.
I lost his audio.
over, say, a particular magic barrel. So in the old world, can you hear me okay? My internet is starting to go bad. Oh, you there? Oh, anyway.
You're cutting in and out, Ron.
Yeah, it's kind of bad right here. I'm sorry about that.
I wonder if it'll help if you turn off your camera. Sometimes that helps in Zoom.
Oh, I don't know how to turn that off.
Just say like stop video.
Okay, here we go. Maybe that'll help. Okay. So everybody's familiar with the old world forest names on barrels. You've all seen them before, I would imagine. So the main reason why we changed is simply to get more consistency in the winery. I was explaining earlier that oftentimes when we use a particular forest, you get a lot of variability, and it's difficult for the coopers to replicate a medium or a medium plus style toast. So going in this method with grain, it makes it much easier to reproduce aromas and flavors. My internet is bad. Sorry, guys. Here we go. So here's an example. There simply isn't enough wood if all winemakers wanted wood or barrels made in Tronchet or Allier. There just simply wouldn't be enough. So that's why we will typically make barrels. Tronchet barrels are always extra fine grain. So we'll source extra fine grain from all the other regions and then basically make somewhat of a composite barrel. Many of you may or may not know, so with Bordeaux barrels or with barrels used for Bordelaise wines, you pretty much always use a 225 liter barrel. And it comes in a bunch of different formats. You know, oftentimes you'll see it at a fancy winery, you'll see a barrel such as this, which is called a Chateau Forêt, which is thin stave and a thin stave barrel head. And those oftentimes now are more for show, because you can get the same sort of results with just a standard thin stave barrel. Now you would never, the Burgundians would never use this style of barrel simply because of the format. They use a Burgundy barrel. So you'll see these always in Chardonnay and Pinot Noir houses, as well as oftentimes in the Rhone Valley. There really isn't a huge difference as far as the impact on wine for one or the other. The Burgundians will say during lees stirring that a 228 liter for Chardonnay will always be a little bit better, but the jury's, there's studies that go back and forth. Other styles of barrels that are in the industry that are popular is a 265 liter, which is typically used at Gallo Winery. And this is referred to sometimes as a GX barrel. And they're just basically fitting more gallons per square foot on the same 225 liter rack. Hogsheads are used in Australia. Rhone casks, sort of self-explanatory. Those get used for Syrah mostly. They don't get used for the other red varieties, Grenache, Mourvedre, simply because most of those wines get put into older barrels. And then you have the larger ones that are pretty much made, they're custom made tanks. And pungents. Pungents are pretty popular for primary fermentation. And what we do is when we know a customer is going to use this for primary, we ship them with one head out. And it's just easier for them to deal with once they receive them. So these are the forest areas in United States where we are sourcing, or the industry sources wood. And this is all Quercus alba wood. Demptos focuses on Missouri. However, the industry will buy from all these different regions. And unlike the forest of France, this is all private land. So oftentimes we have to, work the relationships for years before we're allowed on some of the properties. This is a pretty popular question. Oftentimes, what are the typical barrel prices? And this, even this year, this is pretty accurate. American oak has come down in price a little bit. The demand for bourbon is beginning to subside. And depending on where the euro sits, it can fluctuate maybe by another, I don't know, 3 to 10%. See here. This is pretty interesting here. Unlike American oak, French and Hungarian oak always has to be hand split. And the reason why we do that is the master cooper has to cut on the grain at a very specific spot in order to prevent any sort of leakage. So the European species of wood are very prone to leakage, so we cannot quarter saw in the way that we do an American oak barrel. So consequently, it takes a little bit more time, and that's part of the expense as well. Once we actually go from the forest to the mill and now onto the seasoning yard, we have to leave the wood out in a yard such as this to basically leach out all the tannins, to get that resinous or pininess out of the wood and preserve all the sweet characteristics. So when the wood is done aging, and we do extend aging up to 48 months, we bring it into what looks like a kiln, but it really isn't. It basically lets the wood settle and stop moving. And then we can put it, take it into the cooperage to make fine barrels that you're using now. So in a cooperage, this is the basic process. Once we raise the barrel, which we refer to as a rosette, then we set them up in a toasting room. And the guys you see in the toasting room there in the photo, most of those barrels will have a work order or a winery work order. Oops, I'm gonna hold off a second, my internet. Okay, so every barrel will be identified for a particular winery. So for the Côte Bonneville barrels that are made in France, they'll have a small little code on them that will reflect the toast, what age of wood that we're using, and of course, we can retrace that wood set all the way back to the forest. So all along the time we control the wood from the forest, we have UPC codes that track or trace the barrels.
And the barrels that go to Côte Bonneville, those are the best barrels in the cooperage, right, Ron?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, all fine Cabernet uses fine grain or extra fine. And the differences between cooperages is a little bit, it's kind of the secret sauce for the master cooper when they're toasting. So if you put it in a term, you know, of a chef, the chef can get the same piece of salmon or filet mignon and maybe prepare it slightly differently, but it's for all intents purposes the same thing. You can get two wildly different flavors from it. So in categorizing Demtos barrels, say on the flavor spectrum, we are more on the savory end of barrels. Some barrels are on the sweeter side. Some barrels are on the soft, you know, that really help the mid palate. We focus on length, structure, and a little bit of the savory characteristic from the toast. So,
and Ron, to that point, we talked a little bit earlier about why you would choose American oak versus French oak and different grains and things like that. And so I forget if that's coming or if that's
oh, I mean, we could, yeah. So here we go. We can talk about it now. So a lot of times there's this debate on what's better, and it's really about all in the application and what the winemaker is looking for. So if a winemaker is looking really for help up front for aromas and some of the sweeter caramelized sugars, and they are going to really take control through either primary fermentation or the finishing of the wine for structure, and they just want heavier upfront notes, well, they'll typically go with American oak, especially if they're in maybe a 5 or 10% new oak application. What they're trying to do is just get bang for the buck. And old, you know, say 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of American oak out there that wasn't really aged or seasoned properly, and they did taste like whiskey barrels. and they were quite frankly horrible. They had a piney, resinous quality and pretty harsh. So what we've learned is that if we can take the American oak staves to 36 months and sometimes out to 48 months, it really, really helps out a lot. So American oak is upfront aromas. French oak is going to be much more subtle, but you're really looking for finish, complexity, and allowing the tannins to be really lengthened out. You know, and winemakers always refer to wines with great finish and length and structure. And especially with premium Cabernet, that's typically why you're using French oak, because it really kind of polymerizes the tannins of the wood, the tannins, what you're controlling in the winery. And instead of making wines with abrupt finishes, it really lengthens them out. So, and Hungarian oak is, you know, it's interesting. It gets caught in between structurally.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before we go into Hungarian,
Yeah.
Bill wanted to know, how old are the forests? We know the forests in France are old. How old are the American forests in general?
Yeah, typically we're harvesting between 70 and 90 years. So about half the time is a French tree.
That's still pretty fast. I mean, they harvest Doug firs in 35, 40 now. Well, 35 now, so.
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of the logs that we're buying right now from McGinnis Wood Products, they're, you know, 80 to 90 years old. The challenge oftentimes in securing American oak is it's all private land, and a lot of the forests aren't that healthy because of bark beetle infestations. And there's a little bit of stay off my property mentality in Missouri. They just don't want you on their land, but it behooves them to allow us to not really, in some cases, clear cut to get rid of some of the dead trees and diseased trees to get to the healthy ones. So a little bit more of a struggle to get the quality American oak logs for that reason. Let's see here. Hungarian oak is kind of in between. It's not as complex aromatically, but structurally it does almost the same thing. With wines that get aged beyond, say, 18 months, it doesn't work as well as, say, barrels of tight grain in France or extra fine grain. I'd say these barrels work really, really well up to 18 months for Bordelaise wines, and they work really, really great also for Chardonnay.
So Hungarian oak, you have to hand split as well, right?
Correct.
Because that's a feature. Adrish was asking why the French oak is prone to leakage, and so why they have to be split instead of sawn, and that's a function of the species of the tree, if I remember correctly.
Correct. There's these things called tyloses that basically that supply the nutrients from the soil into the tree, and it's basically like a capillary system that provides all the nutrients. And when you kill or you fall a European oak tree or a French oak tree, all of those little capillary systems, they basically open up. So liquid can move freely within the grain. With American oak, that capillary system basically shuts down. So you can quarter saw American oak without the fear of it leaking lengthwise through the stave. So often, you know, I'm sure you've had a barrel that you couldn't really pinhole where it was leaking, but the whole stave was saturated. And that's a case where it wasn't cut properly on the billet of wood. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And typically we like to control that in the cooperage when we test the barrels, but you know, they're organic products. Sometimes it happens. So, yeah, and so here you get pretty much kind of the flavor profile of French oak. And all of these aromas that you see here, toasted almonds, brioche, creme brulee, lemon chiffon, all of these get intensified as you gain toast. So light, medium plus, heavy, all of these will get more intensified as you go along the temperature guidelines for those toasts. Now, I will say, even in the past 5 years, we're making as many medium toast as medium plus. It's becoming, winemakers are choosing barrels with a little bit less toast. 15 years ago, we used to make well over, say, 2,000 heavy toast barrels. Last vintage, I think we made 15 for one particular program. So heavy toast doesn't even really exist any longer for wine. It seems that more moderate toast levels and also staves that have been aged longer, 36 months, 48 months, seem to be a bit more in vogue now because the impact of the wine is much more subtle. And I think it can get absorbed into the wine or integrated much easier. When you have heavy toast levels, it becomes more difficult to integrate, especially if you're using new oak percentages at, say, 50% or more, or 70%, which can be quite common these days. Let's see here. This is a pretty interesting chart that, you know, especially when I give this presentation to first year enology students about extraction, tannin content, oxidation rates. So for example, Tronchet typically will get applied to Cabernet Sauvignon and is aged 18 months and longer. So Cabernet does well with oxygen. So you want a barrel that has a high oxygen potential as far as integration. But what you don't want, if you're aging a wine that long, you do not want to be adding lots of wood tannin. Because the tannin at that point, you've kind of already in your mind, Carrie, have figured out structurally what you want from your wine, either from acid, from picking decisions, primary fermentation. So you don't want the barrel adding any more structure. If you're using a tight grain barrel, we make the assumption that you figured that piece out for your wine. What you really want is the consistency of a barrel that has the higher oxygenation levels. And that will oftentimes reveal terroir of your wine or your vineyard. So you'll get more specificity from your vineyard and the barrel won't be so dominant, especially when you're using lower toasting levels. So if you use the complete, for this example, you use a barrel from Limousin, which is the whitest grain that has the highest tannin content and the lowest oxidation potential. This is very typical of what you would see in cognac. Because cognac, they want the structure, they want lots of extra color, and cognac already is extremely aromatic, much like Viognier. So you don't need all the extra sugars. So that's why Limousin would get used for cognac. And then you kind of have everything in between that would get used for different wines. And oftentimes it's dictated by time in barrel and winemaker style and preference. And it's something that you learn over time what works well for a particular vineyard. You know, toast levels, age of wood, and things of that nature. So maybe there's a lot of questions from something like this, but this is really, if salespeople out there really spoke just about this chart and tried to match vineyards with this, I think there would be a higher success rate with a lot more barrels out there.
Well, last week, Dad was saying that one of the reasons that we chose the barrels that we did is that when we planted the vineyard in 1992, we sold fruit to everybody until 2001 and tasted our fruit in all these different barrels. And so we had the advantage of figuring out, of tasting, you know, what matches with this piece and this piece. And we have barrels that will go into Côte that don't go into carriage house and vice versa. There's a lot, the Demtos goes into both, but we have one cooperage that's exclusively Côte and one that is exclusively carriage house, and that's because they just pair better with those parts of the vineyard because they're so different, and it's a better match. Okay,
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
first of all, before I forget, we have about 3 requests, Ron, for this presentation. So do you mind sharing it with me and I can send it out
Yeah,
afterward?
no problem.
Okay, perfect.
Happy to.
Excellent. And before we leave the slide with the limousine and the cognac, how long is cognac barrel aged?
Well, you know, it can go, if I remember correctly, anywhere from say 5 to 6 years, all the way up to Remy Tray, which is 100 years. So it's basically, I forget what they call it in wine terms. It's like a Solara. So what they do is over time, the master distiller will hand down a recipe or a formula. Is like, okay, this is what I've been managing for the past, in my career, the last 30 years, because that particular master distiller won't be able to see the end of the life for Remy Tray. So they pass it on. So yeah, so upwards of 100 years. And that's the one you see in the Baccarat Crystal from Remy Martin, which is, I can't remember what it is, but I think a 750 is in around $6,000 or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, when I went to cognac, we were at Hennessy and we tasted some cognac that had been started in the 1850s. And it was,
Right.
it was in a gallon jug at that point. But some of it can age. It was delicious. Not gonna lie, but I think it's been about 100 years in the barrel.
Yeah, it's super caramelly and a lot of like reduced toffee notes, and it's so viscous.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So do you want me to get out of this now, or?
Well,
I think this is pretty much done. Anybody have any questions about this stuff? Yeah, I mean, oftentimes, you know, in selecting barrels for particular wines, you know, you can, the one thing that is really unique is Cabernet that gets extended aging time. So you have to be really, really careful on what you use, because, you know, you're managing the vineyard for 9 months or 12 months or whatever it might be. If the winemaker has it during primary fermentation for 10 to maybe 30 days at the most. And then the barrel has it for anywhere from 18 months to 3 years. So when you're buying barrels for extended aging, you always have to be really, really careful on what you're choosing, because it spends the most time in that particular vessel. So oftentimes what I recommend is start slowly with a particular coupe. If someone's coming to me for the first time, say, don't buy 10, buy 2 and see how they work over time, because it's something that you just don't get a feel for in 2 or 3 vintages. It takes a long time. So
that's the challenge of gaining experience in winemaking, is that everything just takes a lot of repetitions and a lot of time, but it's what makes it fun.
Who has a question?
Oh, we have Scott has a question. Does the term Solara mean that you're mixing older aged wines with newer, younger vintages? We have Pedro Jimenez that's labeled Solara. Is that the same thing? Yes.
Go ahead.
I was going to say yes, it is. What happens is you get your oxidative loss, your evaporative loss through the barrels, because they're semi-permeable membrane. I mean, they let air in and out, and so you get evaporation out. And what we do is we'll go through and we'll top coat with other coat wine from the same vintage. So we're always concentrating that same wine. And in the Solaris system, which they do in sherry and they do in cognac, they get new wine and they fill them up again. And so they're always mixing the top barrels. They go to, and it's always a vintage mix, and you get a different kind of consistency that way. A very different flavor profile. And Ron, if we still have you, Adrish wants to know how you got into this business.
I was a cellar rat at Thomas Fogarty Vineyards, and a gentleman, a salesperson by the name of from Sagan Moreau was visiting the winery, and I was finishing up the vintage, and this was in January of '01, I believe. And he said, "I need someone to sell barrels. Do you want to do it?" And I said, "Well, my job's wrapping up in a month. Sure." So I didn't want to go back to working in high tech. So I said, "Sure, why not?" I knew nothing. And so what they did, they put me to work in the cooperage for a month. And from there, he gave me a phone and a truck and said, "Good luck." Yeah.
Well, I think it's really interesting, the point that you touched on at the beginning of the old world concept of forest-based wines versus the new world concept of tightness of grain, because in a way, that's not that different than grapes and wines, because the old world concept is Bordeaux comes from Bordeaux, and the new world concept is Cabernet is Cabernet. And it's kind of an interesting, I mean, we find ourselves in an interesting juxtaposition because we don't, except for Train Station, we don't make Cabernet and the red label Harv. Oh, I was going to show you where that comes from. Sorry. So except for I mean, in general, we make those site-specific wines, and it's interesting to see that I don't know if they're going away from that in terms of wines in the old world, but it's interesting to see they're going away from that in terms of barrels. Dad, what's your question?
Am I on mute? Okay. Just for those that haven't had a chance to tour in the winery, we have all French oak, no American oak. As Carrie said, we have 8 coopers, and when we started, there were 5 that we stipulated we really wanted, and Demptos from the very beginning has been an essential part of our program. When we tasted it in these different wineries with our fruit, it was always outstanding, and it's continued that way. We use 27 millimeter thickness staves because we're in a desert and the evaporation rate is slower. And so that's another point that Ron had brought out, the difference in the staves. And we use the extra tight grain for the same reason that the evaporative process is slower than with a wider grain.
Your barrels are upside down, Adrish. I was standing on the ceiling punching grapes down. So for those of you guys who don't know, I'm going to point out right now that I think that Adrish behind your head is the picture of you. Oh, that's Ben. Okay. But Adrish worked for a couple weeks at Harvest with us last year. So next week he's going to talk about his Harvest experience, and hopefully all of his pictures will be upright. That's your task.
He was a little in over his head, I think is what he's trying to say. So Paul, how did your tart turn out?
Oh, he's off cooking.
Oh, he's off cooking. We just have a staff picture. Okay.
Yeah.
Almost done. I'm just topping it.
Topping it. Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully you get it all topped up so you can show us before we check out. Because I do have one more thing. I did promise Harv that we were talking about the different wines with so normally we make I'm going to let Mom tell you about the wines while I find the picture. Mom, tell us about the red label Cabernet.
Okay, so we make, as you know, Bordeaux blends, site specific. Well, 2006 vintage, we were blind tasting all the lots like we do every year. And there was, we always rate them and evaluate them. And there was a lot that was just eye-popping. This is like, wow, you can't blend this. This is going to be a standalone wine. And Hugh told me, no, that's not what we do. We don't do that. And I said, well, let's just keep this separate and see, because this wine is just really special. So we kind of went back and forth, and every time, yeah, we're going to have to meet Jen on this, but we went back and forth, and I was always told we don't do that. And I said, well, but sometimes you have to think outside the box, and maybe we could do that. So we should just see, because you can always blend it, but you can't take it back out of the blend. So it came time to getting ready to design the label, pick the bottle, do all the stuff that you have to do to make a wine come to, you know, the package deal. We were at the bottling line that day, and he's saying, what capsule are you going to put on that? Well, of course, I hadn't thought of the capsule. But we had, in the old days, wax. And I thought, well, it's wax. It's not that much. He says, well, you could use these capsules. And I said, okay, fine. We'll use those. And he says, I think this is dumb. I think you should just blend it. And I said, well, we're not going to. So we kind of had a little standoff that day. And it came off the line, and it was doing really nice. And then one day I was walking into the winery with some friends now, customers from New York, and Lynn's not here tonight. She has been here, and I get a call from a friend of mine in Seattle. Says, "Congratulations!" I said, "Great for what?" He goes, "You just got 96 points on that Cabernet. That's the highest scoring Cabernet in the state of
No,
Washington."
the highest scoring red wine to ever come out of the state of Washington.
And I said, "Woohoo!"
So
I was vindicated. So the wine did really well. And anyways, we get to make it when we get the wow factor. So Carrie will show you in the vineyard where it comes from typically. We don't always have it, which is why we don't always make it. When we do, it's only about a ton of fruit. So
yeah,
it's a little bit
short. So the Merlot from the Côte is in this block, and the Cabernet is up here, and there's these little short rows on the end. And what happens is the wind blows from the west over to the east. And so the mountains are off to the west over here. That's Rainier. And this part of the vineyard, it's a little more scoured. And there's a little more soil deposition over here. So we have to manage those a little bit differently than the vines that don't have as much soil within that block. But every once in a while, they just have this different, the flavors are different depending on what rows you're in. And every once in a while, those short rows we'll be tasting through and we'll be like, okay, this is the Carriage House block. This is the Côte block. This is Cabernet. And when we're tasting through everything blind and it's like, oh yeah, there's another step change up. There's another wow factor. When that happens, that's when we make Cabernet. So, we've only done it, we did it in 6, 8, 12, and 13, and we haven't made it since. And it really just takes the conditions. We get about 2 barrels every time we do it. So
I have to tell you a story about the Cabernet because it happened today, oddly enough. So I was trying to make the tart and trying to burn barrels, trying to clean the kitchen, trying to take care of the puppy. And my phone kept ringing and ringing, and a lot of people are thirsty today, I guess, so that's good. So one of my customers left me a voicemail and said, call me. I said, okay, fine. So I called him and I said, hi, this is so-and-so. I said, yeah, I know you. And he said, well, he said, you like to tell stories, so I have a story I want to tell you. I said, great, tell me your story. He said, well, we're moving to Alaska for a year, a very remote part of Alaska. So I'm thinking, okay, so he's going to tell me he doesn't want to be in the wine or sit out the wine club for the year. Okay, fine. But he said, so we've loaded everything we own or that we're taking with us into 2 containers and our car, and we're sitting in here at an airport waiting for our ship to come in. And I said, so we're at this hotel and there's not even a cup of coffee. Can't get anything. We're hungry. So he said, all we could find was some Indian food. And so he said, so we ordered Indian food. And he said, and the Uber driver brought it. And he said, I said, well, how was that? And he says, oh, it was surprisingly good. He said, but they didn't send any utensils. And I said, well, that's because the Indians use their fingers. You don't need utensils. And he goes, so we're trying to take the foil and make little spoons to eat our food. And he said, so the guests can't give. He said, now, we like really good wine. You know that I buy, I love your wines. But he said that Cabernet, he said, that's a little spendy. And I don't often buy that. But he said, I bought a bottle of that. And he said, so we said, let's have that bottle tonight. So they're having the red label Cabernet with their Indian food with their fingers in the hotel before they go to Alaska for the year. And so he sends me a picture of their 2 little plastic glasses that you get in hotel rooms with this beauty. He said, I got to tell you, he said, that wine was fabulous.
And
He
you
said-
know if it tastes fabulous out of like hotel plastic
He
cups,
said-
it's really good.
He said, I was a little skeptical that any wine would be worth that much, but he said, that is really, really good. So I said, I'm glad you liked it. And I think Indian food would be a good pairing with that wine. So we'll let Adrish come up with the recipe for that one.
Yeah, I'm gonna just unmute you and ask you, put you on the spot. Do you have any ideas for, oh, I can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. What you wanna do for a recipe for next week?
Thanks. I mean, I think what are we drinking next week?
The train station red blend.
Train station red blend.
It's got some Syrah in it.
All right. I'll need to think about this, but I mean, the last time that we had like chicken curry at your place, I mean that was
fabulous.
that paired
Knock it out.
perfectly.
Yeah, with
With-
Carriage House.
That was Carriage House.
Yeah, that was Carriage House though. What year
One
was
of our
that?
harvest discoveries was that Indian food and Carriage House are amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like what, a 2012?
Hmm?
Was that a 2012?
Yeah, I think it was, or 11 or 12.
Yeah.
Or
So
maybe-
I mean, I don't know. I'll have to come up with something, I guess. But I think in general, all of your wines, but especially the Carriage House, pair really well with like a chicken curry or. I mean, I think it's the Indian spices that go really well.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
for sure.
Well, if anybody else has favorite pairings, we are happy to
Entertain them.
we're happy to.
Milo, what's your thought?
Milo's so cute. I love looking at his little face. Yeah, so any recipes that
So
you
Paul's
guys
back.
have.
How did it work out?
Yeah, how'd your tart go? Let's see.
Where's this? Oh,
That is beautiful.
beautiful.
We're gonna raise a glass to you.
Yeah, nice job.
It's vegan, and I don't know what puff pastry is. I've never used that in my life. But I went into a Chinese market, and they had this puff. It was a puff pastry, but it also said Chinese pancake. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, I used the first time I did it with a puff pastry. We should buy it like where you buy the phyllo in the supermarket. I have not used it either. This time I just used a pie pastry, but I didn't roll it as thin. And it's delicious, but it's a little harder to eat. It's a little more crumbly because of the style of pastry that I usually make. But the flavor is really good. So I'm sure it's going to be just fine. Oh, look at the
We're gonna watch
baters are
Cindy flip hers over right
flipping it
now.
over. Let's see.
I love this cooking together. I am so glad that you guys are on this
adventure,
food and wine adventure with us. It makes it so much more fun.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's okay. Just break the little things out, put them in there. That's fine.
Good.
It gets real pretty when it all gets on top of each other.
So my only skillet that can go in the oven is an iron skillet that's about this big. So
That's okay.
Okay. Now we're gonna group top with.
What was that, Cindy?
it is awesome.
Sorry, I didn't know I was talking to you.
It's your testing.
All right, we can turn you off.
Ricotta cheese. I don't know how you spread that.
This is great. All right, we'll let you, you don't have to.
Becky, I know you didn't do it because it's got mushrooms, so what
No,
you do?
Jason likes mushrooms.
Oh,
He's
good.
cooking.
Did you do it?
Yeah, she said Jason's making the tart.
Oh, good job.
We got a lot of works in progress. So Adrish, we're gonna want something that's quick and easy. And Dad has to go change water. So before Tony's getting hungry. Hey, Co. So it's almost 6 o'clock. Do we have any other questions for Ron?
Or anybody?
Or anybody?
And
Otherwise,
that Paul moves around. Whew.
I'm gonna say cheers to all the chefs.
Yeah.
And yeah, Ron, thank you so much. Everybody.
Oh, thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it. This is fun.
Awesome. And you can come join us next week. Even next week, you don't even have to say anything. You can just listen and drink your beer.
And if you want to learn more about the vineyards, tomorrow, 5:30.
Okay.
And then the following week, it's Quintessa on Red Mountain. Oh, there goes the arugula. It's so pretty.
Apparently on Fridays, we're going to start our cooking show.
Yeah.
That's great.
Oh, tomorrow the wine that we're talking about is Carriage House. So I think whatever vintage you have, Tony, will be perfectly fine. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you so much. You as well. Cheers.
Thank you. I'm excited to eat this.
Let us know how it goes.
I think it pairs really well with a Coke. I liked it with a Coke a lot.
I just like the chance to drink Coke at 5.
Yeah, that's true too. But...
Trying to keep up with Mom. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Hey, Kathy, I didn't get almonds that were already peeled. I got like real almonds and had to crack them. And
Wow.
Wow.
You put far more work into it than needs to be, but I'm sure it's going to be delicious.
it was a whole new adventure. Thank you.
Taking it up a level, lay it down and take it up.
That is beautiful.
That's our peeps.
All right. Thanks, guys.